Close your eyes now, and let us drift backward through time, through centuries of whispered legends and marble corridors, to a moment when the world stood balanced on the edge of transformation. The air in ancient Rome carries the scent of cedar wood and burning oil lamps, the distant murmur of fountains echoing through stone courtyards where shadows lengthen in the afternoon sun. It is here, in this city of 7 hills, where temples rise toward cloudless skies and the Tiber River flows like liquid silver through the heart of civilization, that our story begins. Not with thunder or the clash of swords, but with a young man, barely more than a boy, receiving news that will reshape his life and the destiny of million yet unborn. His name is Gaius Octavius, though history will come to know him by another name entirely. He's 18 years old, slender and often ill, his constitution fragile compared to the robust warriors who dominate Roman politics. Yet within this unassuming frame burns an ambition as patient and inexorable as the turning of seasons. On this particular day, messengers arrive bearing scrolls sealed with the mark of Julius Caesar himself. And when the wax is broken and the words are read aloud, the world tilts beneath young Octavian's feet. His great-uncle, the most powerful man in Rome, has been assassinated, struck down by daggers in the Senate House, blood pooling on marble floors where senators once debated the fate of nations. But there is more. In Caesar's will, formally witnessed and legally binding, the dictator has named this slender youth as his primary heir, adopting him posthumously as his son. Imagine the weight of that moment. The torches flicker in their bronze sconces, casting dancing shadows across frescoed walls painted with scenes of gods and heroes. Outside, Rome continues its eternal rhythm, merchants haggling in the forum, priests making offerings at temple altars, women drawing water from public fountains, while children play into narrow streets that wind like rivers between insulae rising 4 and 5 stories towards the sky. But for Octavian, everything has changed. He is no longer merely the son of a minor provincial family, no longer just a young man of moderate prospects. He is Caesar's heir. The mantle of destiny settles upon his shoulders like a cloak woven from starlight and shadow, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. His mother Attia watches her son with eyes that hold both pride and fear. She knows what this inheritance means, not just wealth and status, but danger beyond imagining. Rome is a cauldron of ambition where powerful men circle like wolves, their teeth bared beneath practiced smiles. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and consul, expects to inherit the dictator's power and influence. The Senate, those aging patricians who still dream of the Republic's glory days. Opportunity in Caesar's death, a chance to reclaim authority they believe was stolen from them. And throughout the city, in taverns and bathhouses, in the homes of the wealthy and the tenements of the poor, everyone speculates about what will come next. Will there be civil war again? Will the legions march on Rome? Will the blood of the mighty water the streets until the gutters run red? But Octavian surprises them all. Instead of rushing forward to claim his inheritance, instead of demanding immediate recognition and power, he moves with the careful deliberation of a chess master contemplating a board where every piece might mean life or death. He accepts Caesar's name, becoming Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and with it accepts all the debts of honour and vengeance that such a name implies. He speaks softly to the Senate, showing deference to men 3 times his age, men whose hands still metaphorically drip with his adoptive father's blood. He approaches Mark Antony not as a rival, but as a humble supplicant, a boy seeking guidance from a seasoned warrior. And all the while, behind those careful dark eyes, calculations spin like wheels within wheels, mapping pathways through the labyrinth of Roman politics that others cannot yet perceive. The legions watch this young heir with curiosity. Veterans who marched with Caesar through Gaul, who crossed the Rubicon and fought at Pharsalus, wonder what manner of man this slender youth will prove to be. He lacks his adoptive father's physical charisma, that leonine presence that could command a room with a single gesture. He lacks Caesar's military reputation, earned through decades of campaigns in distant lands. But what he possesses, what will ultimately prove more valuable than all the martial glory in the world, is patience. An almost supernatural ability to wait, to watch, to gather pieces onto his side of the board, while his enemies exhaust themselves in premature displays of force. The days lengthen into months, and the political landscape of Rome shifts like sand dunes beneath desert winds. Antony grows increasingly bold, assuming that this boy heir poses no real threat to his ambitions. He dismisses Octavian in the Senate, mocks him at public gatherings, refuses to honour financial obligations owed to Caesar's heir. It is a miscalculation that will echo through the ages. For while Antony indulges in wine and theatrical displays, while he wraps himself in Caesar's popularity without understanding the methodical mind that built such devotion, Octavian moves through Rome like a ghost, making promises, forming alliances, and slowly, inexorably binding the legions to his cause, not through force, but through careful attention to their needs and interests. He sells his inheritance to pay Caesar's bequests to the common people, earning their gratitude. He honours his adoptive father's memory with games and festivals, keeping the dictator's legend alive while positioning himself as the rightful heir to that legend. And when the Senate finally turns against Antony, when the consul's overreach frightens even those who initially supported him, it is Octavian who emerges as the Senate's unlikely champion. This teenage heir commanding legions against Caesar's former lieutenant in a conflict that will reshape the Mediterranean world. Through the long Italian nights, as stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, young Octavian lies awake planning moves years in advance. He understands something that Caesar never fully grasped, something that will make all the difference in the trials to come. Raw power is not enough. Military genius is not enough. To truly rule Rome, to fundamentally transform its nature without triggering the kind of backlash that left Caesar bleeding on the Senate floor, one must master the art of appearances. One must convince the Romans that nothing has changed even while everything changes. One must wear the mask of the Republic while quietly, patiently building an empire. As the soft seasons drift from summer heat to autumn's golden fade, as leaves turn copper and bronze on the hillsides surrounding Rome, the young heir begins to understand the full scope of the task before him. He must avenge Caesar, honour demands it, and the legions expect it. But he must also transcend Caesar, learning from his adoptive father's mistakes, avoiding the arrogance that transforms allies into assassins. It is a path that will require decades of careful navigation, demanding every ounce of political genius he can muster. And so, in these early days of his ascension, Octavian makes a choice that will define everything that follows. He will not be another Caesar, brilliant and doomed. He will be something Rome has never seen before. Patient where others are rash, subtle where others are bold, content to move with glacial slowness toward goals that others pursue with reckless haste. The stage is set, the players assume their positions, and in the gathering twilight of the Republic, as the old order begins its final graceful dissolution, a new Rome gestates in the careful mind of an 18-year-old heir who understands that true power lies not in the sword, but in the patience to wait until the perfect moment to strike. The years unfold like a slow river, finding its path through ancient stone, and across the Roman world, 3 men emerge from the chaos of Caesar's death to divide power among themselves. It is called the Second Triumvirate, a formal arrangement legally sanctioned, unlike the informal alliance that once bound Caesar, Pompey and Crassus. Octavian, Mark Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus meet on a small island in a river, near Bononia. surrounded by their armies, each man wary of the others, each understanding that this alliance is built not on trust but on mutual necessity. The air is thick with autumn mist, and the sound of the river flowing past carries with it the whisper of thousands of lives that will be extinguished in the purges to come. They divide the world between them like merchants portioning goods. Antony takes the rich eastern provinces, where Greek culture still flourishes, and tribute flows like honey into Roman coffers. Lepidus receives Africa and Hispania, territories important but already fading into secondary status even before the ink dries on their agreements. And Octavian, still young, still underestimated, takes Italy and the West, the heart of Roman power, the source from which legions are recruited and where the Senate convenes to debate matters of state. To the casual observer, it might seem that Antony has secured the better portion, controlling as he does the wealthy kingdoms of the East. But Octavian understands geography and politics in ways his older colleague does not. Control Roman Italy, and you control the source of legitimacy itself. Let Antony have his eastern riches. They will mean nothing when the Senate and people of Rome eventually must choose between competing visions of the future. But first there are scores to settle, old wounds to cauterize with flame and steel. The Triumvirate publishes prescription lists, names of senators, equestrians, wealthy citizens marked for death, their property to be confiscated to fund the armies that will hunt down Caesar's assassins. It is a brutal period, one that will stain the reputation of all three triumvirs for centuries to come. Through the streets of Rome, soldiers march with lists in hand, knocking on doors in the hours before dawn, dragging senators from their beds, executing them in front of their families before nailing their severed heads to the speaker's platform in the forum. The great orator Cicero meets his end this way, his eloquent voice silenced forever, his hands, those hands that wrote philosophical treatises and devastating political speeches, cut off and displayed alongside his head as a warning to those who might speak against the new order. Octavian participates in these purges, and history will remember this darkness. He is not yet the wise Augustus, not yet the peaceful founder of an empire. He is still becoming, still learning the hard lessons of power, still discovering that to build something new, the old must sometimes be swept away with merciless efficiency. It is a terrible education, one that will haunt him in later years when he seeks to present himself as a bringer of peace and restoration. But in this moment, in these blood-soaked months following Caesar's assassination, sentiment is a luxury he cannot afford. The armies of the Triumvirate march east, chasing Brutus and Cassius across the Adriatic, through Macedonia, toward a final confrontation at Philippi in the autumn of 42 BCE. The battlefield lies near the ancient city, flanked by the hills and marshland, a natural amphitheatre where the fate of Rome will be decided. On one side, the forces of the Republic's last defenders, noble, principled, doomed. On the other, the legions of the Triumvirate, men who fight not for abstract ideals but for wealth, land, and the memory of a murdered dictator who promised them the world. The battle unfolds in stages, across multiple days, under skies that drift from clear blue to storm grey and back again. At first, the advantage shifts back and forth like tide against shore. Brutus's forces break through Octavian's lines, the young heir is ill again, his chronic weakness leaving him unable to command effectively, and legend will later claim he had to be carried from his tent barely ahead of enemy soldiers who sought to capture him. But Antony, that brilliant battlefield commander, rallies the triumviral forces and succors through Cassius's position with such overwhelming force that the old conspirator, believing all is lost, takes his own life rather than face defeat. The second battle, days later, proves decisive. Brutus, that most philosophical of assassins, watches his army dissolve under the relentless pressure of Antony's veterans. When night falls and the scope of the disaster becomes clear, he follows Cassius into death, running upon a sword held by a loyal friend. The noblest Roman of them all, Shakespeare will later call him, and perhaps there is truth in that assessment. But nobility proves no match for the grinding machinery of triumviral vengeance. The Republic's last champions lie dead on foreign soil, and the world they fought to preserve dies with them. Octavian returns to Italy changed by these experiences, tempered by illness and battle, by political intrigue and the weight of decisions that have cost thousands their lives. He is 21 years old and already one of the 3 most powerful men in the Mediterranean world. But power is a restless thing, never satisfied with mere stability. The Triumvirate begins to crack almost as soon as victory is achieved. Lepidus, always the weakest of the 3, makes a clumsy play for greater authority and finds himself outmaneuvered by Octavian, who strips him of his provinces and forces him into retirement, allowed to live but politically neutered, maintaining only the ceremonial role of Pontifex Maximus until death finally releases him from the indignity of relevance. Now, there are only 2, Octavian and Antony, the young heir and the veteran warrior, circling each other across a divided world. For a time they maintain the pretense of alliance. Antony even marries Octavian's sister Octavia, a political union meant to bind the triumvirs together through family ties. But everyone understands that this is merely a pause, not a peace. The question is not whether they will eventually clash, but when and under what circumstances, and which of them will prove clever enough to ensure that when the final confrontation comes, they hold the moral high ground in the eyes of Rome. Octavian spends these years consolidating his position in the West, distributing land to veterans, building a network of loyal clients and supporters throughout Italy and the western provinces. He is learning statecraft in the most demanding school imaginable, making mistakes and correcting them, discovering through trial and error how to manage the Senate without appearing to dominate it, how to command armies without seeming to threaten the civilian government, how to accumulate power while convincing everyone that he is merely a faithful servant of the Republic, reluctantly accepting authority only because the times demand it. His body remains weak. He suffers from recurring illnesses throughout his life, periods of fever and fatigue that leave him bedridden for days or weeks at a time. But this physical fragility masks a mind of extraordinary resilience and cunning. Where Caesar was the lion, magnificent and terrifying, Octavian is the spider, patient and methodical, spinning webs that his enemies don't recognize as traps until the silk tightens around them and escape becomes impossible. He studies his opponents, learning their weaknesses, understanding their desires, and then carefully, systematically, he gives them enough rope to hang themselves while he watches from a safe distance. Hands apparently clean, expression carefully neutral. The political landscape of Rome shifts month by month, season by season, and through it all Octavian maintains his position, never overreaching, never revealing the full extent of his ambitions. He is Caesar's heir, yes, but he will not repeat Caesar's mistakes. He will not rush toward kingship, will not alarm the Senate so thoroughly that they feel compelled to reach for daggers hidden beneath togas. Instead, he will move so slowly, so carefully, that by the time they realize what has happened, the transformation will be complete and irreversible, and they will have accepted each step along the way as reasonable and necessary given the circumstances of the moment. But all this careful patience requires time, and time is the one resource that conflict with Antony will not grant him indefinitely. Far across the sea in the ancient land of Egypt, where the Nile flows through desert sands and pyramids stand as monuments to dynasties long vanished, events are unfolding that will bring this Cold War between triumvirs to its inevitable dramatic conclusion. Antony has met a queen, and in meeting her, he has set in motion a chain of events that will reshape the world. Alexandria gleams white and gold in the Egyptian sun, a city of wonders where the great lighthouse guides ships to harbour, and the famous library holds the accumulated knowledge of centuries. It is here, in palaces cooled by fountains and shaded by palm trees, where silk curtains flutter in breezes scented with frankincense and myrrh, that Mark Antony falls under the spell of Cleopatra, the seventh Philippa, Queen of Egypt and the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She is not young, in her late 20s when they meet, around the same age as Antony himself, and by all accounts not conventionally beautiful in the way Greek sculptors idealized feminine form. But what she possesses transcends mere physical attractiveness. She is brilliant, speaking 9 languages fluently, educated in philosophy and science, a woman who once captivated Julius Caesar himself and bore him a son. Her voice, ancient writers tell us, was like a many-stringed instrument, able to shift tones and moods with effortless precision, whether conversing with Egyptian priests in their ancient tongue or debating philosophy with Greek scholars in perfect Attic dialect. Antony arrives in the east as conqueror and administrator, tasked with organizing the provinces and extracting tribute to fund Rome's endless military campaigns. But Cleopatra transforms him, slowly, inexorably, from Roman consul into something more complicated. A man torn between 2 worlds, between the stern martial virtues of Rome and the sensual sophistication of Hellenistic culture. She hosts him at banquets where the cost of a single evening's entertainment could fund a legion for a month. She sails with him on barges draped in purple silk, their golden oars keeping time to the music of flutes and lyres. She bears him twins, and later another son, binding him to her not just through passion but through the most fundamental of human connections, children who represent their shared future. In Rome, Octavian watches these developments with the careful attention of a general studying an enemy's movements. Reports arrive regularly. Antony has abandoned Roman dress for Greek robes. Antony speaks of making Alexandria a second capital. Antony distributes Roman territories to Cleopatra and their children in a ceremony that mockingly echoes Roman triumphal traditions. Each piece of news is filed away, added to the growing dossier of evidence that Octavian is carefully, patiently accumulating. He does not need to fabricate charges against his rival. Antony is doing the work for him, alienating Roman sensibilities with every passing season, transforming himself in Roman eyes from triumvirate into Eastern potentate, from defender of Caesar's legacy into Cleopatra's consort. The break becomes public and irrevocable when Antony formally divorces Octavia, Octavian's sister, a woman renowned for her virtue and loyalty, who has raised not only her own children but Antony's children from previous marriages with patient devotion. The insult is calculated and severe, a rejection not just of a wife but of the familial bond that theoretically united the triumvirs. In Rome, public opinion begins to shift. Antony, once Caesar's most trusted lieutenant, once the hero of Philippi, is increasingly viewed as corrupted by Eastern luxury, unmanned by foreign enchantments, no longer properly Roman. Octavian uses this moment with surgical precision. He does not declare war on Antony directly. That would be civil war, Roman against Roman, brother against brother, exactly the kind of conflict-weary citizens desperately wish to avoid. Instead, he frames the coming confrontation as a war of civilization against barbarism, West against East, Rome against Egypt. The Senate is persuaded to strip Antony of his powers and declare war not on the wayward consul, but on Cleopatra herself, that dangerous Eastern queen who has seduced a Roman general and threatens to corrupt the Republic's values with foreign decadence. It is masterful propaganda, and it works. The entire moral weight of the conflict shifts. Suddenly this is not about 2 ambitious men fighting for supremacy, but about Rome defending itself against an existential threat. This foreign woman who once captivated Caesar and now controls Antony, who dreams of ruling Rome from Alexandria, who represents everything the Romans fear about the East's luxurious, monarchical, un-Roman character. Never mind that this characterization is oversimplified at best, actively misleading at worst. In politics, perception matters more than truth, and Octavian understands this fundamental principle in ways that Antony, for all his military brilliance, does not. The lovers make their preparations in Alexandria, gathering ships from across the eastern Mediterranean, assembling an armada that includes massive Egyptian vessels, quinqueremes and larger floating fortresses designed more for intimidation than maneuverability. Antony's strategy seems to be to overwhelm Octavian's forces through sheer size and power, to win a decisive naval victory that will leave his rival with no choice but to negotiate or face destruction. It is a bold plan, the kind of straightforward military solution that has served Antony well in previous campaigns. But he is not fighting another Triumvirate army now. He is fighting a man who has spent a decade studying how to defeat him, who knows his weaknesses and patterns, and who has no intention of allowing the conflict to be decided through honest battle, if subtler means will suffice. The fleets converge near the Greek coast in the waters off Actium, where the Ambracian Gulf opens to the Ionian Sea. Summer hangs heavy over the ancient landscape, the sun beating down on wooden decks and bronze rams, on thousands of soldiers and sailors who wait for the order that will send them into battle. The world holds its breath, sensing that something fundamental is about to change, that when the smoke clears from these waters, the old order will be gone forever, replaced by something new and unprecedented in Roman history. Antony and Cleopatra stand together on the deck of their flagship, surrounded by the assembled might of the East. Across the water, Octavian waits with his general Agrippa, that brilliant naval commander who has spent months planning for this moment, studying currents and winds, understanding the tactical situation with the kind of technical expertise that Antony, despite his battlefield experience, has never fully developed. The two forces face each other as the sun climbs toward noon, and in that suspended moment before violence erupts, the fate of the Mediterranean world hangs balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip toward futures that neither side can fully predict, but both understand will reshape civilization itself. The Battle of Actium begins on September 2nd, 31 BCE, under clear skies that offer no mercy from the summer heat. The Ambracian Gulf shimmers like hammered bronze, and across its waters hundreds of ships maneuver into position, Antony's massive vessels on one side, Octavian's lighter, more maneuverable fleet on the other. This is not just a battle, but a collision of philosophies, of approaches to power and warfare. Antony has built his strategy around overwhelming force, trusting in the superior size and firepower of his quinqueremes and larger vessels, each one a floating fortress, bristling with soldiers ready to board enemy ships and turn naval combat into the kind of close-quarters fighting where Roman legionaries excel. Octavian, advised by Agrippa, has taken a different approach. Smaller, faster ships that can outmaneuver their ponderous opponents, using rams and fire to strike and withdraw before the enemy can bring their superior numbers to bear. The engagement unfolds slowly at first, as these massive battles often do. Ships probe for advantage, testing enemy formations, seeking weak points where a decisive thrust might break through and turn order into chaos. The sound of rams striking hulls echoes across the water like thunder, followed by the screams of men and the cracking of wood as vessels founder and sink. On the decks of Antony's ships, soldiers wait in armour that grows hot beneath the relentless sun, their throats dry, their hands tight on weapons, watching as Agrippa's fleet darts and weaves around them like birds harassing a lumbering beast. Then, inexplicably to those who witness it, Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron, 60 ships positioned at the rear of Antony's formation, suddenly raises sail and flees the battle, heading south toward open sea. What happens next will be debated by historians for 2,000 years. Does Antony lose his nerve? Does he panic? Or is this all part of a predetermined plan? a strategic withdrawal that goes tragically wrong. What is certain is that Antony, seeing Cleopatra's ships departing, abandons his own flagship and transfers to a faster vessel, pursuing the Egyptian queen and leaving his fleet behind to continue fighting without its commander. The effect is catastrophic. Antony's forces, already struggling against Agrippa's superior tactics, collapse once word spreads that their general has fled. Some ships fight on with desperate courage, their crews refusing to surrender even as flames consume their vessels and the sea around them fills with the debris of defeat. Others strike their colours and submit to Octavian's forces, preferring captivity to death. By the time the sun sets that day, painting the water red and gold, the battle is over. Hundreds of ships have been destroyed or captured, thousands lie dead or dying, and the political balance of the Mediterranean world has fundamentally, irrevocably shifted. Octavian does not immediately pursue Antony and Cleopatra. Instead, he consolidates his victory, accepting the surrender of Antony's remaining forces, distributing clemency with calculated generosity to those who submit quickly, while making examples of those who resist. The message is clear: oppose me and face destruction. Surrender and be welcomed back into the Roman fold. It is the same patient, methodical approach he has employed throughout his rise to power, always understanding that true victory means not just defeating enemies, but converting them into allies or, at minimum, neutralizing them as threats. Antony and Cleopatra flee to Alexandria, where they spend the winter in a twilight existence, knowing that Octavian will come eventually, but uncertain when or how. They hold banquets that grow increasingly desperate, revelries that mask growing panic as the reality of their situation becomes undeniable. The kingdoms and client states that once sent tribute to Antony now send ambassadors to Octavian. The legions that once followed Antony's eagles now march under the banners of his rival. The world they built together crumbles around them like sandcastles before the tide. When Octavian's forces finally arrive in Egypt the following summer, the end comes swiftly. Antony attempts one final resistance outside Alexandria, but his remaining troops defect or flee, unwilling to die for a cause already lost. Believing falsely that Cleopatra has taken her own life, Antony falls upon his sword in the Roman fashion, seeking an honourable death. But the wound is not immediately fatal, and he lingers long enough to be carried to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where he dies in her arms, blood staining the marble floors of that monument she had built as her own future tomb. Cleopatra attempts to negotiate with Octavian, trying to secure safety for her children, and perhaps salvage some measure of independence for Egypt. But Octavian is not Julius Caesar, susceptible to her charms and brilliant conversation. He is cold, practical, already envisioning how her presence in his triumph will legitimize his victory and cement his position in Rome. When she realizes that she is to be paraded through Rome's streets as a captive displayed to jeering crowds like a defeated barbarian chieftain, she chooses death instead. The famous asp, smuggled to her in a basket of figs, delivers its venom, and the last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt dies as she lived, on her own terms, defiant to the end. Egypt falls to Rome without further resistance, its vast wealth now flowing into Octavian's treasury, its grain feeding Rome's masses, its ancient mysteries becoming just another provincial curiosity in the expanding Roman Empire. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, is hunted down and killed. Octavian cannot allow a potential rival who might claim descent from the divine Julius to survive. But Cleopatra's children by Antony are spared, and raised in Rome by Octavia, that same long-suffering wife whom Antony divorced. It is a gesture of mercy that serves multiple purposes, demonstrating Octavian's magnanimity, while removing any future threat these children might pose. As news of victory spreads across the Mediterranean world, celebrations erupt in cities from Hispania to Syria. But the real significance of Actium and its aftermath lies not in the military victory itself, though that is impressive enough, but in what it represents. The last rival who could challenge Octavian's supremacy is gone. The last independent Hellenistic kingdom has been absorbed into Rome's domains. And most important of all, the civil wars that have torn the Roman world apart for decades have finally definitively ended. The survivors are exhausted, traumatized, desperate for peace at almost any price, and Octavian, standing alone at the pinnacle of power, understands that this exhaustion, this desperate yearning for stability, is his greatest asset. He returns to Rome not as a conqueror, but as a bringer of peace, not as Caesar returning to impose his will, but as the Senate's faithful servant who has reluctantly accepted the burden of power only because circumstances demanded it. He closes the doors of the Temple of Janus, a ritual act that symbolizes Rome is no longer at war, something that has happened only twice in 7 centuries of Roman history. The message is unmistakable. The age of civil war is over. The age of peace has begun. And the architect of this new order, the man who made it all possible, is the slender, frequently ill, patient genius who once stood as an 18-year-old boy receiving news of his great-uncle's death and his own unexpected inheritance. The Republic's long death has reached its final chapter, but the story of the empire, of Augustus and the Pax Romana, of marble temples and golden ages, of laws and literature that will shape Western civilization for 2 millennia, that story is only beginning. The return to Rome in 29 BCE is orchestrated with the same careful attention to optics and symbolism that has characterized all of Octavian's political moves. He enters the city not in the manner of a military dictator, but as a triumphant general who has secured peace after decades of chaos. 3 consecutive triumphs are held, one for his campaigns in Illyria, one for Actium, and one for the conquest of Egypt, and the city explodes in celebration. Gold and silver flow through the streets as donatives are distributed to the common people. Temples and public buildings are restored or newly constructed. The markets overflow with tribute from Egypt and the East. And everywhere in speeches and poetry, in official pronouncements and casual conversations, the same theme echoes. Peace has returned at last, and Octavian is its bringer. But having achieved supreme power, he now faces the most delicate challenge of his career: how to keep it without suffering Caesar's fate. The memory of the Ides of March haunts him, a warning written in his adoptive father's blood. Caesar was assassinated not because he lacked power, but because he was perceived as threatening the Republic itself, as attempting to make himself king in a society that had defined itself against monarchy for 5 centuries. Octavian must find a way to exercise absolute authority while maintaining the fiction that the Republic still exists, that the Senate still governs, that the Roman people still control their own destiny through time-honoured institutions and traditions. The solution he devises is brilliant in its subtlety. In January 27 BCE, he appears before the Senate and offers to resign all his extraordinary powers, to return control of the provinces and armies to the Senate and people, to retire to private life having fulfilled his duty to restore order. It is political theatre of the highest order, and everyone in the Senate understands the script they are meant to follow. They beg him to reconsider, pleading that the state still needs his guidance, that only he possesses the auctoritas, that uniquely Roman combination of moral authority and prestige to maintain peace and order. After appropriate reluctance, he agrees to retain control of the provinces where legions are stationed, ostensibly to ensure military stability, while returning peaceful provinces to traditional senatorial administration. The Senate, grateful for his apparent moderation, showers him with honours. They grant him a new name, Augustus, meaning the revered one, carrying religious overtones of augury and divine favour without the explicit kingship that would have triggered republican alarm. They commission a golden shield inscribed with his virtues, courage, clemency, justice and piety, to be displayed in the Senate House. They vote him the title Princeps, meaning first citizen, a traditional republican term now transformed into something new, the foundation of what will become the Principate, a system of government that will endure for 3 centuries. On the surface, nothing has changed. The Senate still meets, still debates, still passes legislation. Consuls are still elected annually. Tribunes still hold their traditional powers. All the familiar mechanisms of republican government continue to function exactly as they always have. But beneath this carefully maintained facade, everything has changed. Augustus, for we must now call him by this name, controls the armies, controls the provinces where those armies are stationed, controls access to resources and patronage, and most important of all, controls the perception that he is merely the Republic's servant rather than its master. It is a masterpiece of political engineering, and it succeeds precisely because it is so gradual, so subtle, so carefully calibrated never to push too hard or demand too much at once. Where Caesar demanded to be made dictator perpetuo and paid with his life, Augustus accepts only those powers that seem necessary and temporary. Where Caesar dressed in royal purple and sat on a golden throne, Augustus wears a simple toga and lives in a modest house on the Palatine. Where Caesar's coins bore his image with a crown of laurels suggesting kingship, Augustus's coins emphasize his role as restorer of the Republic, as princeps rather than rex. He understands that Romans don't object to being ruled. They have always been ruled by aristocratic families who dominated the Senate and magistracies through wealth and patronage. What they object to is the appearance of being ruled, the explicit acknowledgement that one man holds power over all others. Augustus gives them the appearance of republican liberty while systematically concentrating power in his own hands. It is hypocrisy, certainly, but it is hypocrisy in service of stability. And after decades of civil war, stability has become the highest political good, more valuable than liberty, more precious than the Republic's ancient traditions. He memorializes his achievements in a document called the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, the deeds of the divine Augustus, which will be inscribed on bronze pillars outside his mausoleum and copied throughout the empire. It is one of the most remarkable pieces of propaganda ever produced, a first-person account of his rise to power that manages to present absolute authority as reluctant public service, civil war as justified vengeance, and the transformation of republic into empire as restoration rather than revolution. Reading it, one would never know that thousands died in proscriptions, that rivals were eliminated through cold calculation, that the Republic's death was anything other than natural evolution. It is history written by the victor with such skill that even today, with 2 millennia of perspective, scholars must work to tease out what really happened from what Augustus wanted everyone to believe had happened. But the Res Gestae succeeds not just because it obscures inconvenient truths, but because it also contains genuine achievements. Augustus did restore peace. He did stabilize the frontiers. He did reform the administration of provinces, reducing the corruption and exploitation that had characterized Roman governance in previous generations. He did beautify Rome, transforming it from a city of brick and wood, prone to fires and collapses, into a capital worthy of an empire. The lies are wrapped in truths, the propaganda leavened with real accomplishment, and this combination proves irresistible not just to his contemporaries but to subsequent generations who will look back on his reign as a golden age. The Senate, meanwhile, adapts to the new reality. Some senators resent the loss of real power, the reduction of their ancient institution to a rubber stamp for Augustus's decisions. But most recognize that the alternative to Augustus is not the Republic restored, but another round of civil wars, more prescriptions, more confiscations, more instability. They learn to thrive within the system he has created, using proximity to the princeps as the new currency of influence, competing for his favour rather than competing directly for power. The Republic's forms persist, but its substance has been hollowed out and replaced with something that will prove more durable, more capable of governing a vast empire than the old system of competing aristocrats ever was. Augustus himself seems almost surprised by how well his political architecture functions. He has created a system that can survive its creator, that doesn't depend on any single individual's genius, but rather on institutional structures and incentives that align the interests of the ruling class with maintenance of the new order. It is not democracy, the Roman Republic was never that, but neither is it quite despotism in the traditional sense. It is something new under the sun, an autocracy that wears republican dress, an empire governed by an emperor who insists he is merely the first among equals. As the years drift past and Augustus's position becomes increasingly secure, as the generation that remembered the Republic fades away and is replaced by Romans who have known only the Principate, the system solidifies into permanence. The transformation is complete, and so subtle has been its progression that no single moment can be identified as the instant when Republic became Empire. Like watching the tide come in, the change seems imperceptible from moment to moment, yet when one looks back at where the shoreline was and where it stands now, the magnitude of transformation becomes undeniable. Under Augustus's steady governance, the Mediterranean world enters a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity that will later be remembered as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It begins slowly, like dawn spreading across a darkened landscape, but gradually, year by year, its effects become undeniable. The legions that once fought each other in civil wars are deployed to secure and expand the frontiers. In the north, along the Rhine and Danube rivers, they established defensive lines that will protect the empire's heart from Germanic tribes. In the south, Egypt's grain flows reliably to feed Rome's 1,000,000 inhabitants. In the east, arrangements with Parthia establish a stable, if wary, coexistence. And in the west, Hispania and Gaul settle into peaceful integration with the wider Roman world. Their aristocracies increasingly Romanized, their youth learning Latin and aspiring to service in the legions or administration. The true genius of the Pax Romana lies not in military might, though that remains essential, but in the systematic organization of prosperity. Augustus reforms provincial administration, establishing regular salaries for governors and creating oversight mechanisms to reduce the endemic corruption that characterized the late Republic. He builds roads that stretch from Britain to Syria, engineered marvels that will last for centuries, facilitating trade and communication across distances that once took months to traverse. Along these roads, merchants carry wine and olive oil from Italy, grain from Egypt, silk from the Far East, amber from the Baltic, and 1,000 other commodities that bind the empire together in networks of mutual economic interest. Cities flourish as never before. In Gaul, new urban centres rise where Celtic tribes once lived in hill forts. In North Africa, ancient Punic cities rebuild and expand under Roman rule. Throughout Greece and Asia Minor, the Greek cities that resented Roman conquest gradually recognized the benefits of inclusion in a vast, peaceful, well-administered empire. Local aristocracies find that they can thrive under Roman rule, maintaining their wealth and status while gaining access to Roman citizenship, Roman law, and the vast opportunities that imperial service provides. It is a policy of integration rather than mere domination, and it proves remarkably successful in creating loyalty among diverse peoples who might otherwise resent foreign rule. Rome itself transforms most dramatically. Augustus claims to have found the city built of brick and to have left it marble, and while this is characteristic exaggeration, there is truth beneath the boast. The Forum Romanum is renovated and expanded. The Forum Augustum is constructed, a vast new public space surrounded by colonnades and dominated by the Temple of Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger, commemorating Augustus's vengeance for Caesar's assassination. The Ara Pacis Augustae, the altar of Augustan peace, is erected on the Campus Martius. its marble reliefs depicting the imperial family in procession, surrounded by allegorical figures representing the peace and prosperity that Augustus has brought to Rome. The arts flourish in this atmosphere of stability and patronage. Poets who might once have written bitter satires about civil war now compose verses celebrating peace and Augustus's achievements. Virgil writes the Aeneid, an epic that traces Rome's origins to the Trojan hero Aeneas, establishing a mythological pedigree that links Augustus to Rome's founder and, through Venus, to the gods themselves. The poem is political propaganda, certainly, but propaganda elevated to the highest art, and it will become one of the foundational texts of Western literature. Horace produces odes and epistles that define Augustan literary culture, praising moderation, morality, and the simple pleasures of rural life while celebrating the peace that makes such pleasures possible. Livy writes his monumental history of Rome, Ab Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city, an epic narrative that presents Roman history as a story of moral virtue and divine favour, culminating implicitly in Augustus's reign as the fulfilment of Rome's destiny. Ovid composes the Metamorphoses, that sprawling collection of myths and transformations that will enchant readers for 2 millennia. Even when Ovid offends Augustus with his Ars Amatoria, the art of love, a witty manual of seduction that contradicts the emperor's attempts at moral legislation, and his exile to the Black Sea, his poetry continues to circulate and influence Roman literary culture. Augustus himself becomes the centre of an elaborate cult of personality, though one carefully calibrated to avoid the overt deification that would offend traditional Roman sensibilities. In the provinces, temples are erected to Roma and Augustus, worship of the emperor becoming a way for provincials to demonstrate loyalty to Rome while maintaining connection to their traditional religious practices. In Italy, his genius, his divine spirit, is venerated without quite claiming that Augustus himself is a god during his lifetime. It is a careful balance, allowing Augustus to benefit from quasi-religious devotion while avoiding the kind of royal pretensions that led to Caesar's assassination. The Augustan settlement extends beyond politics and culture to touch the most intimate aspects of Roman life. Concerned that the old Roman virtues are eroding, that aristocratic families are having too few children, that traditional marriage is giving way to serial divorce and childlessness, Augustus implements a series of moral and social reforms. The Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus and Lex Papia Poppaea impose penalties on unmarried men and women of childbearing age, offer incentives for large families, and restrict adultery and divorce. These laws are deeply unpopular among the aristocratic class they target, and their effectiveness remains questionable, but they reveal Augustus's vision of comprehensive reform, his belief that the princeps' authority should extend not just to military and political affairs, but to the moral character of Roman society itself. His own family becomes a model for the virtues he wishes to promote, at least in public presentation. His wife Livia Powell is portrayed as the perfect Roman matron, modest, devoted, skilled in traditional women's crafts like weaving, even while wielding substantial political influence behind the scenes. His daughter Julia is expected to embody feminine virtue and provide heirs for the dynasty. The reality, as always, is more complicated than the propaganda, and Augustus will discover to his sorrow that his own family cannot always live up to the moral standards he seeks to impose on Rome. But for now, in these golden years of the Pax Romana, the image holds, and the imperial family serves as the moral exemplar for the empire. The provinces send tribute that funds public works and military expansion. The legions remain loyal, their soldiers seeing Augustus as the source of their pay, their land grants upon retirement, and their opportunities for advancement. The Senate accepts its reduced role in exchange for stability and the chance to participate in governing an empire rather than squabbling over a dying republic. The common people of Rome receive bread and circuses, subsidized grain and spectacular entertainments that keep them fed and distracted. And at the center of this complex, carefully balanced system sits Augustus, the spider in the web, monitoring threats, adjusting policies, always planning years ahead, always calculating how to maintain the peace without appearing to be a tyrant. It is exhausting work, demanding constant vigilance and political skill of the highest order. But Augustus has spent his entire adult life preparing for this role, and he executes it with a mastery that will be studied by rulers and political theorists for centuries. He has achieved what Caesar could not: absolute power accepted by the governed, stability without the constant threat of assassination, a system that can endure beyond its creator's lifetime. The Pax Romana has begun, and the Mediterranean world settles into a long afternoon of peace that will last, with interruptions for 2 centuries, an unprecedented period in ancient history, when warfare retreats to the frontiers and the interior provinces experience sustained prosperity and cultural flourishing. The physical transformation of Rome mirrors the political transformation Augustus has engineered. Throughout his long reign, the city becomes a vast construction site, a laboratory where architectural ambition meets unlimited resources and imperial vision. The traditional Republican city of narrow streets and timber-frame buildings gradually gives way to something grander, more permanent, more worthy of an empire that now stretches from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Marble quarries in distant provinces ship their treasures to Rome, where armies of skilled craftsmen, Greeks, Egyptians, native Italians, work to reshape the urban landscape according to Augustus's vision. The Forum Augustum rises on land purchased at enormous expense, its boundaries marked by a massive perimeter wall that still stands today, bearing scars from ancient fires. At its centre, the Temple of Mars altar dominates the space, its Corinthian columns reaching toward the sky, its pediment decorated with scenes of Mars and Venus, reminding all who pass that Augustus descends from the goddess of love through Aeneas, and thus has divine lineage to match his earthly power. On either side of the temple, colonnades stretch out, their walls lined with niches holding statues of great Romans from the city's legendary past. Aeneas and Romulus, the kings and heroes, the consuls and generals whose deeds built Roman greatness across centuries. Augustus places himself in this lineage, the culmination of Roman history, the fulfillment toward which all previous generations have been striving. But perhaps his most symbolically rich creation is the Era Pacis Augustae, the altar of Augustan peace, dedicated in 9 BCE. This monument encapsulates everything Augustus wishes to communicate about his reign and its meaning. The altar sits within an enclosure whose marble walls bear relief sculptures of astonishing beauty and complexity. On one panel, Aeneas makes sacrifice connecting Augustus to Rome's mythic origins. On another, Mother Earth, or perhaps Italia personified, sits surrounded by symbols of abundance, children on her lap, cattle and crops flourishing around her, representing the prosperity that peace has brought. And most significantly, the imperial family processes in solemn dignity along the altar's sides, each figure carefully positioned according to rank and relationship, presenting the Augustan dynasty as Rome's rightful rulers, their authority natural and ordained by the gods themselves. The message is sophisticated propaganda rendered in stone. Peace is not merely the absence of war, but the foundation for prosperity, family, continuity, all the values that Augustus claims to have restored after decades of civil conflict. The altar dedicates peace itself as something sacred, worthy of ritual and reverence, transforming a political achievement into a religious principle. And Augustus stands at the centre of this new dispensation, the peace-bringer, the father of the country, the one through whom the gods have blessed Rome with security and abundance. He doesn't stop with forums and altars. The Campus Martius, once an open field where citizen soldiers trained for war, becomes a parkland of monuments. Augustus builds his mausoleum there, a massive circular tomb inspired by Etruscan tumuli and Hellenistic royal tombs, where he and his family will rest for eternity at the heart of the city they transformed. The Theatre of Marcellus rises nearby, dedicated to Augustus's nephew and original heir, its curved facade accommodating thousands of spectators who will watch dramatic performances celebrating Roman glory. The Pantheon, though later rebuilt by Hadrian, begins as an Augustan structure, its name, Temple of All the Gods, reflecting Augustus's syncretistic approach to religion, welcoming all deities into Rome's embrace, as he has welcomed all peoples into Rome's empire. But Augustus's architectural vision extends beyond individual monuments to comprehensive urban planning. He divides Rome into 14 regions, each with its own administrative structure, its own services, its own identity within the larger whole. He establishes the Vigiles, a fire brigade that also serves as nighttime police, addressing the endemic problems of urban fires and crime that had plagued Republican Rome. He builds aqueducts bringing fresh water from distant hills, expanding Rome's water supply to support its growing population, and public baths that become centres of social life. The Aqua Julia, Aqua Virgo, and Aqua Alciatina supplement older aqueducts, pouring millions of gallons daily into the city's fountains, baths, and private homes. Yet for all this architectural grandeur, Augustus himself maintains a studied simplicity in his personal life, at least in public presentation. His house on the Palatine Hill, while pleasantly situated, is modest by the standards of earlier Republican grandees, let alone Hellenistic monarchs. He dresses in simple togas supposedly woven by Livia and his daughter Julia, performing traditional Roman masculinity, even while exercising unprecedented power. He eats sparingly, drinks moderately, and makes a show of republican virtue, even while transforming Rome into an imperial capital whose monuments celebrate one man's achievements. This architectural program extends throughout Italy and the provinces. In Gaul, new cities rise on Roman plans, their forums and temples miniature versions of Roman originals. In North Africa, Carthage is refounded as a Roman colony, its harbour rebuilt, its wealth restored under imperial administration. In the East, Greek cities add Roman buildings to their Hellenistic heritage, creating hybrid architectural vocabularies that express both local tradition and Roman power. The roads that connect these cities become engineering marvels in their own right, straight as arrows where possible, superbly drained, paved with stone that will last for centuries, marked at regular interval with milestones indicating distance to Rome. All roads truly do lead to Rome, and on those roads flow the goods, people, and ideas that bind the empire together. Parallel to this physical transformation runs Augustus's attempt to reshape Roman morality and behaviour. The Julian laws on marriage and adultery represent his most ambitious social engineering project. They require men between 25 and 60, and women between 20 and 50 to be married. They penalise the childless and unmarried by restricting their rights to inherit property. They reward parents of multiple children with legal privileges, including priority in seeking public office. And they criminalise adultery, making it a public offence prosecuted by the state rather than a private family matter, with exile as the penalty for convicted women. These laws prove deeply unpopular among the aristocracy, who resent imperial intrusion into private life and who have grown accustomed to more flexible arrangements than Augustus's vision of traditional morality permits. But Augustus persists, believing that Rome's moral character must be restored if the empire is to endure. He promotes the old religion, rebuilding 82 temples in Rome alone, reviving traditional priesthoods, and assuming the role of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, after Lepidus's death, adding religious authority to his political supremacy. The irony, tragic and profound, is that Augustus's own family cannot live by the standards he seeks to impose on Rome. His beloved daughter Julia, married first to Marcellus, then to Agrippa, and finally to Tiberius in dynastic arrangements meant to secure the succession, proves unwilling or unable to conform to the role of perfect Roman matron. Reports reach Augustus carefully, reluctantly, for no one wants to be the bearer of such news, that Julia conducts affairs openly, mocking her father's moral legislation even while benefiting from her position as the emperor's daughter. The scandal becomes undeniable, and Augustus faces a terrible choice: compromise his principles or punish his own daughter under laws he created. He chooses duty over paternity, exiling Julia to Pandateria, a small island off the Italian coast, where she will live out her days separated from Rome and her children, a victim of her father's moral crusade. It is a wound that never heals, a private grief that Augustus carries silently beneath his public dignity. Later, Julia's daughter, Augustus's granddaughter, also named Julia, will suffer similar exile for similar offences, suggesting that perhaps the problem lies not in individual moral failing, but in the impossible tension between Augustus's vision of traditional Roman virtue and the reality of human nature, especially human nature constrained by the dynastic demands of imperial succession. Yet despite these personal tragedies, despite the gap between propaganda and reality, Augustus's architectural and moral programs succeed in reshaping how Romans understand themselves and their city. They live now in a capital of marble and monuments, where every public space reminds them of Augustus's achievements, where religious ritual and civic life intertwine under imperial patronage, where peace and prosperity seem not temporary political achievements but permanent features of a new order blessed by the gods. The brick city of the Republic has become the marble city of the Empire, and in that transformation, Augustus has achieved a kind of immortality, not just in monuments bearing his name, but in the very shape and character of Rome itself. But even emperors cannot escape time's passage or mortality's claims, and as Augustus ages, the question of succession becomes increasingly urgent and increasingly tragic. He has no son of his own. His only child, Julia, provides no male heir from her first marriage to Marcellus, who dies young of illness in 23 BCE, a loss that devastates Augustus and deprives Rome of a promising young leader who seemed the natural heir to imperial power. Augustus then marries Julia to his closest friend and most capable lieutenant, Marcus Agrippa, a brilliant general and administrator whose humble origins would normally have barred him from consideration as emperor, but whose competence and loyalty make him Augustus's de facto second-in-command. Agrippa and Julia produce 5 children, and from these grandchildren Augustus attempts to construct the succession. The 2 eldest boys, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, are adopted by Augustus himself, raised in the imperial household, groomed from childhood for the purple. They are the golden boys of the Augustan succession, handsome, intelligent, popular with the people and the legions. Augustus arranges their careers carefully, granting them honours and offices, sending them on missions to gain experience, always preparing them for the day when they will inherit the empire. He watches them grow with the satisfaction of a craftsman seeing his masterwork take shape, believing that he has finally solved the succession problem that haunts all autocracies. But the fates have other plans. In 2 CE, Lucius dies suddenly while travelling to Hispania, his death attributed to illness, but always suspected by some to be poison, though no convincing evidence ever emerges. A year later, Gaius, who has shown real promise as a military commander during a campaign in Armenia, is wounded in a siege and dies from complications during his journey back to Italy. Within 2 years, both heirs are gone, and Augustus, now in his 60s, finds himself facing the succession crisis anew. Agrippa himself is long dead by this point, having passed away in 12 BCE, depriving Augustus of his most capable lieutenant and Julia of her second husband. Augustus still has grandchildren, Agrippa Posthumus, born after his father's death, and Julia's daughters, but Agrippa Posthumus proves difficult, perhaps mentally unstable, eventually exiled by Augustus for reasons never fully explained in surviving sources, and the daughters, in a society that does not accept female rule, can provide dynasty only through their marriages and their sons. This forces Augustus to turn reluctantly to his stepson Tiberius. He is Livia's son from her first marriage, a capable general who has served Augustus well, but who lacks personal warmth or popularity. The relationship between Augustus and Tiberius has always been complicated. Tiberius was forced to divorce his beloved wife to marry Julia in one of Augustus's dynastic arrangements, a marriage that proved loveless and ultimately disastrous. When Gaius and Lucius were alive, Tiberius lived in their shadow, always the backup plan, never the first choice. His resentment is understandable, as is his reluctance to assume a role he never sought, and for which Augustus clearly wishes there were alternatives. But necessity has its own logic. In 4 CE, Augustus formally adopts Tiberius, making him Tiberius Julius Caesar and designating him as heir. Tiberius is required as a condition of adoption to adopt Germanicus, his nephew and another potential heir, ensuring that even if Tiberius succeeds, the succession will eventually pass to someone with direct blood connection to Augustus through the female line. It is typical of Augustus' careful planning, always thinking generations ahead, always trying to balance competing interests and personalities, always attempting to engineer outcomes through legal and familial arrangements. These personal tragedies take their toll on Augustus. He grows more sombre with age, the cheerful energy of youth replaced by the gravity of a man who has outlived too many loved ones, who has seen his carefully constructed plans collapse repeatedly, who must continue ruling and planning even as his own strength diminishes. His health, never robust, becomes increasingly fragile. He suffers from various ailments, bladder problems, arthritis, seasonal illnesses that leave him bedridden. Yet he continues working, continues attending to the empire's administration, continues the careful performance of princeps that he has maintained for decades. Livia remains constant through these trials, his wife for more than 50 years, his advisor and confidant. Later historians will accuse her of poisoning rivals to advance Tiberius's claims, but evidence for such charges remains thin, likely reflecting later generations' tendency to blame scheming women for historical outcomes rather than acknowledging the role of chance and circumstance. What is certain is that Livia exercises substantial influence throughout Augustus's reign, managing property, corresponding with leaders throughout the empire, serving as a model of Roman matronly virtue, while wielding power that would have shocked earlier generations. As Augustus enters his 70s, the question is no longer whether Tiberius will succeed, but how Augustus can ensure a smooth transition. He grants Tiberius substantial powers, making him co-regent in all but name, ensuring that when death finally comes, there will be no interregnum, no opportunity for rivals to emerge, no repeat of the chaos that followed Julius Caesar's assassination. The legions are bound to Tiberius through careful cultivation and Augustus's explicit endorsement. The Senate understands that Tiberius has Augustus's blessing. The provinces know that resistance would be futile and potentially fatal. In his final years, Augustus becomes increasingly reflective, perhaps understanding that his great experiment, the Principate, the transformation of republic into empire, the creation of institutional autocracy wrapped in republican forms, must ultimately survive without him if it is to have any lasting significance. He has reshaped Rome and the Mediterranean world, established peace where chaos had reigned, created systems of administration that function efficiently across vast distances, But can these achievements endure? Will Tiberius prove capable? Will the succession continue smoothly? Or will Augustus's death trigger new civil wars? These questions haunt him as he retreats more frequently from Rome, seeking rest and recuperation in quieter locations, his villas in Campania, the island of Capri where the air is clean and the pace slower. He watches the sun set over an empire that stretches farther than Rome has ever ruled, embracing peoples who speak dozens of languages, worship hundreds of gods, follow countless local customs and traditions. Yet all of them are bound together now in a Roman peace, governed by Roman law, connected by Roman roads, united under the rule of one man who never claimed to be king, yet exercises power that exceeds any monarch's. The weight of mortality presses down on him, undeniable now, and Augustus begins to understand that his final task is not to rule, but to let go, to pass power to the next generation gracefully, to demonstrate that the system he has created can survive transition from one princeps to another. It is his last and perhaps most important political act, this acceptance of death and preparation for succession. Everything he has built depends on it. The summer of 14 CE arrives hot and languid, the Mediterranean sun beating down on tile roofs and dusty roads, on vineyard terraces climbing hillsides and fishing boats bobbing in harbours from Hispania to Syria. Augustus, now 75 years old and increasingly frail, travels to Campania seeking relief from the heat and his various ailments. He stops in Nola, a modest town where generations later, legends will claim that his father once held office, creating a pleasing symmetry for his life's final chapter. Tiberius, who has been in Illyria overseeing military operations, rushes back upon hearing news of Augustus's deteriorating condition, arriving just in time for a final conversation between stepfather and stepson, emperor and heir. What passes between them in that quiet room with summer light filtering through shuttered windows and the sounds of a provincial town drifting up from the streets below remains private. No secretaries record the conversation, no historians witness the moment. We know only that Tiberius emerges with clear understanding of his responsibilities and Augustus's final wishes, and that the old emperor seems content that the succession is secured, that decades of careful planning will not dissolve into chaos the moment he closes his eyes. Augustus's final days are spent in peace, surrounded by Livia and a small circle of trusted companions. He remains lucid nearly to the end, discussing administrative matters, asking for news from various provinces, maintaining the habits of rule even as his body fails. On August 19th, as afternoon fades toward evening, he asks for a mirror and requests that his hair be combed and his jaw, which has fallen slack, be propped up. The performance must continue even now, the dignity of the princeps maintained until the final curtain. Then, in what will become one of history's most famous deathbed lines, he asks those gathered around him, "Have I played the part well?" It is the question of an actor completing a role, a remarkably self-aware acknowledgement that his entire reign has been performance, that the modest princeps, the reluctant holder of power, the restorer of the republic, has always been a character he played rather than his authentic self. When they assure him that yes, he has performed admirably, he delivers the traditional line called out at the end of Roman comedies. "If I have pleased you, kindly signify appreciation with warm applause." Then, after kissing Livia and murmuring, "Live, mindful of our marriage," he slips into unconsciousness and shortly thereafter breathes his last. The news spreads through the empire with the speed of rumour and official courier combined. In Rome, Tiberius moves quickly to assume power, presenting Augustus's will to the Senate, accepting the powers and titles that make his succession official. There is no resistance, no rival claimant, no legion marching on Rome or senator reaching for a dagger. The transition happens smoothly, almost anticlimactically, exactly as Augustus had planned. The system he created functions as designed, transferring supreme power from one individual to another without plunging the empire back into civil war. Augustus's funeral becomes a state occasion of unprecedented grandeur. His body is carried from Nola to Rome in solemn procession, laid in state in the forum where crowds file past to pay respects. On the day of cremation, his wax effigy is displayed on the funeral couch dressed in triumphal regalia, surrounded by images of his ancestors and allegorical representations of the provinces he ruled. Senators, magistrates, priests, and representatives from throughout the empire process through the streets. Tiberius delivers the funeral oration, recounting Augustus's achievements, the civil wars ended, the peace established, the provinces organized, the city beautified, the frontiers secured. As the flames consume the funeral pyre on the Campus Martius, an eagle is released, rising into the evening sky, symbolizing Augustus's soul ascending to join the gods. The Senate votes him divine honors, declaring him Divus Augustus, officially deifying the man who spent his life carefully avoiding such explicit claims to godhood. Temples will be built to his worship, priests will be appointed to his cult, and henceforth all emperors will hope to be similarly deified upon the death, transforming the principate from merely political office into something approaching sacred kingship. But Augustus's true legacy lies not in temples or divine honours, impressive as those might be. It lies in the system he created, the Pax Romana he established, the transformation of Rome from city-state to empire that he engineered so skillfully that most Romans never quite realised it was happening. He took a republic tearing itself apart through civil war and created an imperial system that will endure, with modifications for nearly 5 centuries in the West and 15 centuries in the East. He established patterns of administration, succession, and military organisation that future rulers will follow or diverge from at their peril. He proved that autocracy could be stable, that one-man rule need not inevitably descend into tyranny, that peace and prosperity were possible if power was exercised with patience and subtlety. Consider what he achieved, this man who began as a sickly teenager and ended as a god. He avenged Caesar's murder without repeating Caesar's mistakes. He won supreme power without appearing to seek it. He exercised absolute authority while maintaining republican forms. He transformed Roman society, culture, architecture, and governance, while convincing everyone that he was merely restoring what had been. He established a dynasty that, despite various setbacks, will continue until Nero's death ends the Julio-Claudian line. And most remarkably, he created a political system stable enough to survive not just his own death, but the deaths of mad emperors, foreign invasions, and internal revolts, continuing to organize Mediterranean civilization for half a millennium. The empire he leaves behind stretches from Britain to Egypt, from Hispania to Syria. Within its borders, perhaps 70 million people live under Roman rule, speaking their local languages, following their local customs, worshipping their local gods, yet all connected through Roman law, Roman roads, Roman administration, and Roman peace. Trade flourishes, cities grow, literature and art thrive. The legions stand guard on distant frontiers, but the interior provinces haven't seen war in decades and won't for decades to come. It is an achievement unprecedented in ancient history and rarely matched since, a vast, diverse, multilingual empire governed efficiently, maintained peacefully, and accepted by its subjects not as oppression, but as order preferable to the alternative chaos. Augustus's coins circulate through markets in Londinium and Antioch, Alexandria and Lutetia. His images stare out from temples and forums in every province. His name is invoked in oaths and prayers. The calendar itself bears his mark. The month once called Sextilis has been renamed Augustus in his honour, just as Quintilis became Julius for Caesar. The very dating system will eventually mark time from Rome's founding rather than consular years, and later, Western civilization will divide all history into before and after Christ. But even this Christian innovation preserves Roman administrative structures that Augustus perfected. He understood something fundamental about power that most rulers miss, that force alone is insufficient, that lasting authority requires consent, or at least acquiescence, from the governed, that people will accept enormous impositions on their freedom if those impositions are presented correctly, if the forms they cherish are preserved even as their substance changes, if they believe they are being governed for their own benefit by a benevolent leader who serves rather than rules. It were masterful manipulation, certainly, but manipulation in service of peace and stability, and after generations of civil war, that peace seemed worth almost any price. As we drift towards sleep ourselves now, let us carry with us this image. An empire at peace, stretching around an inland sea that the Romans call Mare Nostrum, our sea, connected by roads and ships and shared language and law. Cities sleeping under starlight from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Farmers tending fields first planted by their ancestors 1,000 years before. Merchants calculating profits from trade with distant lands, soldiers standing watch on frontier walls, priests making offerings in countless temples, children learning Latin or Greek or both, memorizing Virgil's verses, absorbing Roman values that will shape their understanding of civilization itself. And at the centre of it all, now absent but still present, still shaping events through the institutions he created and the example he set, Augustus, that boy who received news of Caesar's death and his own unexpected inheritance, who spent decades transforming himself from Octavian into Augustus, from Caesar's heir into the first emperor, from mortal politician into divine founder. He played his part well, as he himself recognized in that final question. And the applause he requested has echoed through 2 millennia of history, from contemporary Romans grateful for peace to later generations who study his reign as a masterclass in political transformation. His mausoleum still stands in Rome, though empty now, robbed by barbarians who cared nothing for his achievements. But the empire he built lasted long enough to transmit classical civilization to medieval Europe, long enough for Christianity to spread along Roman roads and become the dominant religion of the West, long enough to shape languages and laws and governmental systems that endure today. When we speak of senates and forums, of aqueducts and arches, of roads built to last forever, and administrative systems designed for efficiency across vast distances, we are speaking of Augustan Rome, of that empire born from republic, of that peace purchased through decades of patient, brilliant, ruthless political manoeuvring. Sleep now, as the empire slept in its golden age, secure behind its legions, prosperous within its borders, at peace with itself at last. Dream of marble cities and straight roads, of ships crossing the Mare Nostrum with grain and wine and silk, of poets composing verses in Latin that will be read 2,000 years hence, of an order that seemed eternal, even though we know now how fragile and temporary all human achievements ultimately prove. Augustus created something magnificent, and though it eventually crumbled like all empires must, for a time, for a long, peaceful, prosperous time, it stood as the greatest political achievement of the ancient world, home to millions who lived and loved and dreamed under the protection of that Pax Romana that one patient, clever, frequently ill young man spent his life creating. Have we played the part well, recounting his story? If so, let the applause be your gentle drift into sleep, carrying with you images of ancient Rome, of Augustus who was once Octavian, of an empire at peace, of history's long arc, bending towards those golden years when Mediterranean civilization reached a height it would not see again for 1,000 years. Rest now in the peace that Augustus brought to his world, and remember that even empires begin with a single person making choices. one after another, building something from nothing, transforming the world through will and patience and genius that comes along perhaps once in a millennium. Good night, and may your dreams be touched by that distant Roman peace, that Pax Romana that even now across the gulf of centuries still whispers to us of what human civilization might achieve when war finally ceases and order prevails.